Injuries are absolutely killing fantasy football right now, but we get a little bit of help here in week 8. How is that, you ask? Well, we have no teams on bye this week, so let's go ahead and dive into our quick and dirty top 36 running backs for week 8 fantasy football. But before we dive into the rankings, I gotta continue to show you some of my bigger hits and misses from the week prior here at the running back position. Starting off with a few of the hits, we got Kareem Hunt, Devon Achane, and Jordan Mason. I had Kareem Hunt ranked super high last week and it paid off, and the exact opposite for Devon Achane and Jordan Mason. I dropped them in the rankings last week. A lot of people thought it may have been a little bit too low. It ended up being correct, so that was good. But I had some misses as well, like Javonte Williams, Aaron Jones, and Tony Pollard. Javonte Williams came into the week averaging like 7 fantasy points per game, then exploded on Thursday Night Football. Aaron Jones, there was talks of him going on IR. Then all of a sudden, dude plays, and he plays pretty well. And then Tony Pollard had a great matchup, and once again, in a good matchup, Tony Pollard didn't impress. So that one's on me. I had Tony Pollard ranked way too high last week, but now let's move forward here to week 8 and dive into the tier 1 rankings here for the running back position. And we look right here at tier 1, we got Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, Breece Hall, Kenneth Walker, Joe Mixon, Kyren Williams, Bijan Robinson, and Jordan Mason here for week 8. So let's go back and talk about Saquon Barkley. He's got a matchup this week going up against Cincinnati, and he just absolutely torched his former team, the Giants, last week. He's only had one game all year with under 12 fantasy points. He's averaging 20 fantasy points per game and now has a matchup going up against Cincinnati, who allows what? Yes, 20 fantasy points per game to the running back position, so Saquon Barkley at number 1. And honestly, could be like a 1A and a 1B because right after him is the king, Derrick Henry, in a matchup going up against Cleveland. And it feels like every single week he's having a huge run. He's had a run of at least 27 yards or more in 6 straight ball games. He already has 10 touchdowns on the season. He's averaging his highest yards per touch of his career, and he's gone for over 20 carries in only 3 games. He's not being overly used this year by Baltimore and still putting up huge numbers. Now a matchup going up against Cleveland. They allow 17 fantasy points per game. I expect Baltimore to have a lead in this ball game and rely on the king once again. Then we have Breece Hall going up against New England. He's got back-to-back 20-point games, which has got him all the way up to running back 7 overall. Having Devontae Adams and Garrett Wilson on the outside is only going to continue to help this running game more and more. Now he gets another great matchup going up against New England, who allows the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs at 25.9 points per game. Breece Hall at number 3. Then we go down to Kenneth Walker going up against Buffalo. And it's crazy to me that he has missed 2 games this season and yet is still the running back 8 overall. He hasn't scored under 11 fantasy points in a game, has touchdowns in all but 1 game this season, has 18 targets over his last 3 games, and now we know that DK Metcalf is banged up in a matchup going up against Buffalo, who allows the 2nd most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs at 26.3 points per game. Kenneth Walker at number 4. Number 5 is Joe Mixon going up against the Indianapolis Colts, and he is absolutely eating in this offense. He's played in 4 games this year and has had at least 120 total yards in 3 of them. He's had 5 touchdowns in 4 games, and he absolutely annihilated this Colts defense back in week 1 with 178 total yards and a tutty. This passing game is currently struggling, and the Colts are allowing over 21 fantasy points per game to running backs. Then we go down to Kyren Williams going up against Minnesota, and he continues to eat as the top and basically only option for LA here over the past few weeks. He's had 21 plus touches in all but 1 game this season. He's had a touchdown in every single game, and he's had 100 plus total yards in 3 of his last 4. But now we get Cooper Kupp returning, and honestly, that can only help Kyren Williams. Because for the first time in a long time, maybe opposing defenses need to focus on the passing game a little bit more. Now, Minnesota does allow the 9th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, but it's still at 17.2 points per game. Then we go down to Bijan Robinson going up against Tampa Bay. And where are all those comment clowns the last 2 weeks that complained about Bijan Robinson always being ranked too high? Well, now he's had back-to-back 20-point games. He's the current running back 6 overall in the season, has 3 touchdowns over his last 2 games played, and now a matchup going up against Tampa Bay, who allows over 22 fantasy points per game to the running back position, 11th most, and in a game in which Tampa Bay is struggling to find some offensive weapons, I expect Atlanta to have a lead and rely on the running game a little bit more. And then to round out tier 1, we got Jordan Mason going up against Dallas. Finally, a better matchup for him this week. We know that Brandon Ayuk is done. Deebo Samuel has been sick. George Kittle and Juwan Jennings, they're both questionable to play right now with injuries, and Dallas has allowed the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs at over 25 fantasy points per game. With so many pass-catching weapons banged up, San Francisco is going to have to run the ball more, and that's why Jordan Mason rounds out Tier 1. Now, before I get into Tier 2, I gotta shout out today's sponsor, SeatGeek. And I know last week I told you that my son and I try to go to a different stadium every year in either week 17 or 18. Right now, the leader in the clubhouse is a lot of people telling us to go to Minnesota. Now, I would love to go there and check out US Bank Stadium, but Minnesota in January, I'm going to freeze to death. But if I'm gonna freeze, I might as well get it at a discount, and that's where SeatGeek comes in. With over 28 million downloads right now, they are the #1 rated ticketing app out there. And with over 70,000 events, including concerts, sporting events, and festivals, they have something for everyone. They take tickets from all across the web and put them into one place so you can make sure you're getting a good deal. Each ticket is rated on a scale of 1 to 10, so you gotta look for the green dots. Green means good, red means bad, but you know I'm going to come through for you guys with that discount. So when you find an event that you want to go to on SeatGeek, and I'm sure there's something out there for you, be sure to use the promo code Headliners to get $20 off. That's right, that's $20 off your first purchase using promo code Headliners over on SeatGeek. So make sure you either click the link in the description or the pinned comment. Go out there and find an event you want to go to. I guarantee there's something for everyone. But all right, let's dive back into Tier 2 of the running back rankings. And right here in Tier 2, you can see Josh Jacobs, DeAndre Swift, Jahmyr Gibbs, Kareem Hunt, Devon Achane, James Cook, James Conner, and Aaron Jones. Now for Josh Jacobs, he's got a matchup this week going up against Jacksonville, and something needs to be said for consistency. Even though Josh Jacobs hasn't absolutely killed it this year, he's a locked-in solid RB2. He's had at least 10 fantasy points in 5 of the 7 games this season, 90-plus total yards in 3 straight, 17-plus touches in 3 straight, and now gets a matchup going up against Jacksonville, who allows the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs at 23.2 points per game. Then we go down to DeAndre Swift going up against Washington. He's coming off the bye, and can he stay hot? 3 straight games, over 115 total yards, and a touchdown in 3 straight as well. He's averaging almost 14 fantasy points per game, and this Chicago offense has scored at least 35 points in back-to-back ball games. Now a matchup going up against Washington, they allow 20 fantasy points per game to the running back position. And with potentially no Jaden Daniels for Washington, can Chicago get a lead and rely on the running game a little bit more? Then we go down to Jahmyr Gibbs going up against Tennessee. Out of the top 15 running backs right now in fantasy football, he is one of only 4 that have scored at least 10 fantasy points in each game this season. His efficiency stats are up. He's on pace for more touchdowns in 2024 than 2023, and he can coexist just fine with David Montgomery. Now, Tennessee is pretty solid, but they do allow 19 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. However, as of late, they've faced the likes of Trey Sermon and a bad Miami offense. If not for those cream puff matchups, maybe Tennessee would be allowing a little bit more, and that could boost the potential ceiling of Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery this week. Then we have Kareem Hunt going up against Las Vegas, and he's playing great ever since he signed in Kansas City. A lot of people think that Isaiah Pacheco is going to be rushed back from his injury, and Kareem Hunt is just going to be ignored and done. After everything he's done, probably not gonna happen. Even after getting DeAndre Hopkins, Kareem Hunt is going to be used heavily in this offense. He's had 24 plus touches in back-to-back games, and the Raiders allow the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, so Kareem Hunt inside the top 12 at number 12. Then we go down to Devon Achane going up against Arizona. And Devon Achane, with and without Tua under center, is 2 totally different running backs. With Tua, people need to pull defenders outside the box to take care of the passing game. That hasn't happened in Miami for weeks. Now, we also know that Raheem Mostert is still going to get touches in this backfield, but all of a sudden, the big play opportunities are going to return. Now, on top of all that, it's a great matchup going up against Arizona, who allows 21 fantasy points per game to the running back position. Then we got James Cook going up against Seattle. Ray Davis has definitely earned a role on this team, but it's still James Cook's backfield. They just didn't really need him much last week in week 7. That isn't Ray Davis taking away a role. They beat Tennessee 34-10. James Cook is still averaging 14.7 fantasy points per game and is inside the top 15 running backs on the season. Amari Cooper added to this offense is only going to help the run game, and now a matchup going up against Seattle, who allows the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, so James Cook's at number 14. Then we have another James Conner, going up against Miami, and a healthy James Conner is just going to get fed in this Arizona offense. We all know that. He's had 100 plus total yards in 4 of the 7 games he's played in this season. He's now up inside the top 12 running backs on the year as well, averaging 13 fantasy points per game. If Arizona wants any possible chance at winning this ball game, they need to keep the ball away from Miami. How do you do that? You run the ball successfully, and Miami does allow the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs at 24.5 points per game. And then we're going to round out tier 2 with Aaron Jones going up against the Rams. So let me get this straight. Last week he was on the verge of going on IR. Then he actually plays in week 7 and has one of the best games he's had all year long against one of the better run defenses in the NFL, and now all of a sudden, he just seems good to go. He's had 100 plus total yards in 4 of his 6 games this season, and now gets a great matchup going up against the Rams, who allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to the opposing running backs, and Aaron Jones isn't even on the injury report right now, so he's back up inside tier 2. So now let's move our attention down to tier 3, where we have Alvin Kamara, David Montgomery, Brian Robinson Jr., Tank Bigsby, Javonte Williams, Najee Harris, Rachaad White, and Tony Pollard. For Alvin Kamara, he's going up against the Rams, and he's coming off his worst game of the year. But now word has come out that he's been playing with a broken hand. No wonder he had a season low in touches and yards just last week. But this week, do we get Chris Olave and Derek Carr back? We know that Alvin Kamara's contract just got extended as well, but this is a pretty tough matchup going up against the Chargers. They allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game, but we just saw James Conner last week get 152 total yards against this defense. In my opinion, this all comes down to the availability of Alvin Kamara. Is he going to be limited or miss time with this broken hand? Because if he plays and he's not limited and we do get Chris Olave and Derek Carr back, we're all of a sudden going to have ceiling Kamara as well. Really something we need to wait and see here as the week goes on. Then we go down to David Montgomery going up against Tennessee, and he had an injury scare in week 7, but came back into the game and isn't currently on the team's injury report. Now, since joining Detroit, he has only gone back-to-back games without a touchdown 1 time. Now he has a matchup going up against Tennessee, who allows 19 fantasy points per game, but we all know that David Montgomery is going to get those touchdown looks weekly. Then we got Brian Robinson Jr. going up against Chicago, and he's been working through his own injury issues, but has scored at least 10 fantasy points in every single game he's played this season. He also has touchdowns in all but 1 game, but what's a little bit confusing is his passing work has absolutely vanished the last 2 games. That's really something that added to his ceiling to start the season, and now he's not being included in the passing game at all. Maybe it's just to keep him healthy and not give him those added hits, but now a matchup going up against Chicago, they allow 19 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, so B-Rob is right here at number 19. Then we got Tank Bigsby going up against Green Bay, and with ETN still sidelined, you have to think that Tank continues to get a lot of opportunity in this offense. He just had 26 touches for 118 total yards and 2 touchdowns last week in their game in London. Now he gets a matchup going up against Green Bay, who allows over 20 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs and just got torched on the ground by Joe Mixon. Then we bring up Javonte Williams. He's climbed the rankings because of a matchup going up against Carolina. Now, like I mentioned earlier, coming into week 7, the guy was averaging like 7 fantasy points per game. So what we saw in week 7 may not be the new normal, but this is such a great matchup. He deserves to be up inside the top 24. I got him at 21. Then we go to number 22. It's Najee Harris going up against the New York Giants. Now, Najee is starting to cook. Back-to-back 100-yard games, back-to-back games with a touchdown, and now all of a sudden he's up to the RB20 on the season. Russ is really going to help open up this running game more so than what we saw from Justin Fields, and we already know that Najee can coexist with Jaylen Warren just fine. In a matchup going up against the Giants, who allow almost 20 fantasy points per game, Najee up inside the top 24. How about Rachaad White next in a matchup going up against Atlanta? And this one right now, it's funny how things work out. Rachaad White was all but written off for the season. But then Mike Evans goes down and Chris Godwin goes down, and all of a sudden Rachaad White is about to be that dude that's going to be used a ton in the passing game now for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He's coming off his best game of the year, and I truly expect Tampa Bay to be trailing more often. Now, because of that, they're going to be throwing the ball more often, which means more checkdowns going the way of Rachaad White. Then we round out tier 3 with Tony Pollard going up against Detroit. And what's crazy here is Tony Pollard hasn't really been able to take advantage of many good matchups this season. Overall, this team in Tennessee is just bad, and Mason Rudolph just plain sucks. Now we know DeAndre Hopkins is no longer there, and Calvin Ridley has been added to the injury report, which really means Tony Pollard is going to remain a low-end RB2, especially in a tougher matchup like this going up against Detroit, who allows the third fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and I'm sure Tennessee is going to be trailing in this ballgame and having a hard time running the football. Then let's move down to Tier 4. And this is where I got Chuba Hubbard, J.K. Dobbins, Raheem Mostert, Chase Brown, Nick Chubb, Bucky Irving, and Ramondre Stevenson. For Chuba Hubbard, he's going up against Denver. He's the current RB10 overall. He's had at least 11 fantasy points in 5 straight, touchdowns in 4 of his last 5 games, and 17 plus touches in 5 straight ball games. Now a matchup going up against Denver, who allows 18 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Jake, that sounds so good. Why is Chuba Hubbard so low? Well, Bryce Young is scheduled to start at quarterback this week, which means the scoring opportunities in this offense are about to disappear. If the touchdown opportunities aren't going to be there, that drastically lowers the ceiling for Chuba Hubbard, and that's why he's still inside the top 25, but at number 25. After him is J.K. Dobbins going up against the Saints. Now, he has scored less than 10 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games played. People really want me to rank him higher each and every week, though I just can't. There's no consistency. This team just doesn't provide a lot of scoring opportunities, and if J.K. Dobbins doesn't break off the big one, you're effed. Now a matchup going up against New Orleans is not bad. They do allow the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. But we have seen J.K. Dobbins struggle in good matchups here so far this year. Just due to the lack of consistency, I've got him right here at 26. Then we go down to Raheem Mostert going up against Arizona, and you have to think that his ceiling is going to go up with the return of Tua Tagovailoa. It's going to provide more touchdown chances in Miami. Now by now, everyone knows that Devon Achane is going to get the bulk of the work in this backfield, and because of that, Raheem Mostert's going to be a lot more reliant on touchdowns. But Arizona does allow 21 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and you have to think that those touchdown opportunities will increase dramatically with Tua returning. Then we go down to Chase Brown going up against Philadelphia. He's still the number 1 running back in Cincinnati, but his yardage totals aren't high enough to give him that safe weekly floor. He's not overly involved in the passing game, and Philadelphia is a lot easier to throw on than they are to run on, plus Zach Moss still in the mix. As of right now, Philadelphia allows the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, so we're going to need a big play this week for Chase Brown, and that's why he's dropped down the rankings. Then we go to Nick Chubb going up against Baltimore, and so much has changed here in Cleveland. First, Jerome Ford goes down, then Nick Chubb returns, then Amari Cooper is traded, then Deshaun Watson tears his Achilles. Now, because of all this, so much for being worked in slowly, Nick Chubb. You have to think that he's going to get more and more touches each and every week. They actually made it a point to get him a touchdown just last week, but this is no easy task going up against Baltimore. They do allow 19 fantasy points per game to the opposing running backs, but they are way easier to throw on than they are to run on. Then we have Bucky Irving going up against Atlanta, and he is still the best runner on the ground in Tampa Bay, but without their firepower, are they going to be playing from behind more often, which means they're going to be running less? Rachaad White is going to be the guy involved more in the passing game, and really, the last time these two teams played 3 weeks ago, Bucky Irving didn't get much going on the ground. Really need to wait and see how this backfield looks here in the next couple of weeks. And then Ramondre Stevenson going up against the Jets. So Ramondre returned last week, but only played 50% of the snaps and only had 9 touches in week 7, despite the great matchup going up against Jacksonville. Would have loved to know that going into the week. But here's what's crazy about it. He's only had 1 game worse than that all season long, and that was back in week 3. Who did he play in week 3? These Jets. Now, a lot has changed since week 3, and we just saw Najee Harris run for over 100 yards against them, so it is possible for Ramondre Stevenson to somewhat bounce back, but given the risk, I dropped him down to 31 here in Tier 4, which means we only have Tier 5 left, where we have Tyler Algier, Austin Eckler, Tyrone Tracy, Alexander Madison, and then I threw Jonathan Taylor here at the end. Now, for Tyler Algier, he's going up against Tampa Bay, and his usage has really been up and down, but if Atlanta can get an early lead, I would not be surprised if we see more Tyler Algier down the stretch to ensure the health and safety of Bijan Robinson. Then we have Austin Eckler going up against Chicago. He had his worst game of the season last week, but Washington won the game 40-7, so they really didn't need him either. Now, this game should be a lot closer this week, so Austin Eckler is really a flex play at best. Then we go down to Tyrone Tracy going up against Pittsburgh. He had the worst game of his season as well last week, but it wasn't because Devin Singletary returned. It's really because they fell behind so quick they can never focus on the running game. Plus, Philadelphia is a tough run D to produce against. Well, now they get Pittsburgh, and it's not going to be much easier. Add in the fact that he is going to be splitting touches with Devin Singletary, and that's going to hurt this week. Then we go down to Alexander Mattison going up against Kansas City. I have loved the volume of Alexander Mattison here as of late. 17 plus touches in 3 straight games, and he's had back-to-back games with at least 12 fantasy points. But now they get the Kansas City Chiefs, and they are by far the best run defense in the NFL. Really, the only reason Mattison is even in the rankings is because Kansas City's offense isn't some juggernaut, and in a close game, they'll still try to run the ball in Vegas. And then lastly, I had to include Jonathan Taylor going up against Houston. Now, there is a chance that he could be making his return this week, but at the time of this recording, nothing is for sure. Now, he wasn't able to do much against this Houston defense back in week 1, but I think by this point, we all know a healthy Jonathan Taylor, at worst, is a tier 2 running back each and every week. I just wanted to put him in here as a reminder to make sure that you follow up on his status as the week progresses. Which is going to get us through our quick and dirty top 36 running backs here for week 8 fantasy football. Given that there's no buys, you can see we have a lot of options here this week. There were still a couple other running backs that could make a bid to get up inside the top 36. But maybe you see things a little bit differently, and that's okay. Leave those comments down below. I will try to communicate with as many members out there of Headliner Nation that I possibly can. We do what we do because we want you to find the most success possible. And how do you find the most success possible? You work together as a team. So if you enjoyed today's show, do me a favor, hit the like button and consider subscribing if you haven't already. I'm going to go ahead and get out for the day, but hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.
Analytics, all the chain, all the channels, not